The first question you may have about this class is, what the heck is philosophy? I think most students coming into an introductory class really don't have a very clear idea about what philosophy is or what philosophers do. They just sit around and think? Is that the whole idea? Actually, there's a lot of truth in that. Let me try to answer this question by asking this first of all. What is it that philosophers study? What's the subject area? When you think about the other disciplines in college, say psychology, you know what the psychologists study. They study the mind. Or biology, what do the biologists study? They study living things. What do the sociologists study? They're studying people groups. So what is it that the philosophers study? Philosophy doesn't have this neat, narrow, delimited subject area like these other disciplines do. Rather, philosophers study fundamental concepts and principles and questions in any and every area. So there is philosophy of history. There's philosophy of psychology. There's philosophy of biology. There's philosophy of, you name it, there's philosophical reflection to be done on it. So philosophers aren't limited to one area. They're looking at fundamental concepts and principles in any area. So what's the difference then between what a philosopher is going to ask about history and what a historian, say, asks about history? Well, the historian is going to ask something like, what happened in 1789? And the answer is going to be the Glorious Revolution. I think it was 1788, 1789. Okay, so, and how does the historian work? Well, you know, they dig up these documents and or whatever, and they find out, here's what the facts are, here's what happened. A philosopher isn't going to be asking that question about history. The philosopher is going to ask a question like, what is time? What is history? How do we know anything about the past? Is the past real? What does it mean to say that something caused the Glorious Revolution? What kind of causation are we talking about there? So those are totally different kinds of questions. If you try to get the historian to ask those kinds of questions, they're not interested in it. They say, look, man, you know, the British threw out James II, and they brought in William and Mary. That's the end of the story. The philosopher is asking kind of a level up or a level down question about any of these subject areas. The same goes for any of these other things. So you can do philosophy about any subject area, but there are three kind of main branches of philosophy that are traditionally talked about. There's epistemology, and that's the study of knowledge. It asks, what do we know? Now, our first unit, is after we do logic, is going to be about epistemology. There's metaphysics, the study of being, and metaphysics asks, what exists? And we're going to have a unit in metaphysics. So in epistemology, we're going to ask, how do we know, or do we know, that there's an external world, and so forth. In metaphysics, we're going to ask questions like, does God exist? Does the soul exist? Does free will exist? So we're going to ask questions in that ballpark. The third major branch is ethics, which is the study of morality, asking questions about what's right and wrong, good and evil. Now, we're not going to have an ethics unit because we have a whole class here on ethics, which I encourage all of you to take. Instead, we're going to have a unit on social and political philosophy, which asks a lot of related questions, but in kind of a different context, and is also a lot of fun. So that's what we're going to be covering. So that's what philosophers study. Now, here's another question. What distinguishes a philosophical question from a non-philosophical question? I was trying to get at this with my discussion of historians versus philosophers of history. Here's two characteristics which your readings give, which helps you to identify a specifically philosophical question. First of all, philosophical questions are highly general. right? The historian wants to know what happened in this year. The philosopher wants to know what is an event. That's a far more general kind of question than the historian's asking. Also, philosophical questions are highly fundamental. That is, they're foundational. These are questions about principles that underlie and support many of our other beliefs. So let me give you an example. What you believe about, say, okay, let's say that you decide, hey, the Glorious Revolution, it didn't happen in 1789. It happened in 1790. Well, okay, great. So there's one of my beliefs that's changed. What if you decide the past is an illusion? Well, that changes all of your beliefs about a ton of your beliefs. That's a highly fundamental kind of question. So philosophical questions tend to be very general and also very fundamental. But there's no precise rule for sorting out when does a question become philosophical. It's tough to be exact about that. All right, well, what methods do philosophers use to answer their questions? It's easy to start and say, here's what methods they don't use. Philosophers aren't doing what scientists or historians do. They're not going out and collecting evidence in the lab. They're not using empirical methods like observation or experiment. Philosophers don't do any of that. They sit and think and talk. That's basically what they do. They address their questions through conceptual clarification and logical argument. So because they're asking conceptual questions, that's the way they're going to have to proceed. They're going to explore a belief's logical connections with other beliefs and examine the rational basis of that belief. Now, that's going to be easier to illustrate in our next unit when I give you an example of kind of what philosophers are up to. All right, well, here's another difference between philosophy and your other disciplines. In science and history and these other disciplines, it seems like these disciplines all make progress. We know a lot more about science now than we used to in the past, and so forth in other disciplines. Well, how does philosophy make progress? Well, it's not because all the philosophers realize, hey, we've all realized this answer to this philosophical question is correct and we all agree on it. It's not like Einstein's theory of relativity, we all now agree on that. Nope, something like that doesn't happen. Philosophers continue to fight about every issue forever. They always have and will continue to. So they don't arrive at a consensus about their answers. So that's one reason, by the way, that our textbook in philosophy is different than a textbook you'll ever have in physics. Our textbook in philosophy is a whole bunch of people, as readings from a whole bunch of different philosophers who disagree about lots of stuff and are presenting you totally different answers to the same fundamental questions. Now, you never have a physics textbook like that. The physics textbook is just, here's the answers. Boom, there they are. But that doesn't mean that there's no progress made at all in philosophy. Philosophy makes progress by clarifying questions and issues, thinking of new questions, new objections, new possibilities. You can make progress by debunking a bad argument, and showing, hey, this argument for this position is no good. Here's the problem with it. Or by making new arguments for positions. Now, this is not to say that there's no truth in philosophy, or that nobody's right or wrong, or that you can never know who's right or wrong. That's not what I'm saying. I think students often just assume that. There's no right answers in philosophy, or we could never know what the right answers are. I'm not saying that. Actually, almost every philosopher that you're going to read thinks that they do have the right answer, that is the truth. And the mere fact that they disagree doesn't mean nobody's right. But the discipline itself as a whole just is going to look differently when it comes to consensus than scientific disciplines. All right, well, why would anyone bother to do this, right? What is the point of engaging in philosophy? Isn't this just some kind of intellectual entertainment for nerds? Or I don't know, isn't this a waste of time? Shouldn't we get on with the real business of life and, making money and doing important things like that, getting jobs and so forth? Those things are important, by the way. I don't despise those at all. But why would anyone bother to philosophize? Is this a waste? Now, I'm not going to give you one right answer to this, or the answer I endorse. I'm going to tell you several different answers that different philosophers have put forward. And this is actually a good introduction to the whole class. I'm not teaching you my personal views in this class. Let me say that again. I don't endorse all of the different positions that I'm going to teach you in this class. I'm teaching you a bunch of different views so that you can think about them. And so you can learn how to think. But I'm not giving you my story of the world. For one thing, these people all contradict each other. So if I believed them all, I would be crazy. So anyway, let me tell you a few different answers to this question. Why would anyone bother philosophizing? Well, the Beardsley say, look, if you engage in this practice, if you come along for the ride here, you're going to have increased clarity in your own beliefs about what you believe. You might have an increased assurance that your beliefs are reasonable because you've examined their basis more. And your beliefs might be more consistent with one another if you've logically tested them and you've discovered which ones are contradictory and which ones are coherent. So you can get clear about your own position. Bertrand Russell actually thinks, look, it's true that philosophy doesn't really lead to certainty, but that's actually what's so valuable about it. He says by kind of entering into the critical project of philosophy, which undermines so much of your certainties, it's going to free you from inherited dogmas and open up a wide range of kind of intellectual possibilities for you. And it's going to make you think beyond your own private world and interests. So that's what it can do for you, and that may be very attractive. Now Socrates, who was the hero supposedly of Western philosophy, one of the first and most important, he was deeply convinced, or at least as Plato presents him, that philosophizing makes you a better person. It makes you virtuous. Socrates says, one thing I am ready to fight for as long as I can in word and act, and that is that we shall be better, braver, and more active men if we believe it right to look for what we don't know than if we believe that there's no point in looking because what we don't know we can never discover. In other words, even if our philosophizing never leads us to certainty or to the truth, it'll make us better people than we just throw up our hands and not try. Finally, I think Simon Blackburn has some really good thoughts here. It's like, look, everybody's got a worldview. Everybody's got a philosophy. You've got fundamental beliefs and concepts that are guiding your actions and directing your life. And so, since you've already got a philosophy, you might as well examine it and see if it's any good. He says, a system of thought is something we live in, just as much as a house. And if our intellectual house is cramped and confined, we need to know what better structures are possible. This idea that your structure of beliefs is like a house that you live in, it goes way back. You'll see it again in Descartes, who wants to examine the foundations of his house of knowledge, his house of beliefs. Blackburn says, look, ideas matter. Why do they matter? Because in the end, it is ideas for which people kill each other. It's because of our ideas about what others are like, or who we are, or what our interests or rights require, that we go to war or oppress others with a good conscience, or sometimes even acquiesce in our own oppression by others. So your beliefs matter, your ideas matter for your life and for the lives of others. And that's what's exciting about the task of philosophy that we're going to engage in this year.